You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
When you start out talking about what the future may hold for our industry, one of the big things that we talk about is EVs. And there's nowhere else in the world where that conversation about EVs is more prominent than in Norway. We're going to talk about where Norway is with EVs and what it means for retailers, whether you're in Norway or any other country that's looking at Norway. So today we're going to talk to Magnar Møkkelgård, which is the Americanization of his name. He is one of our NACS strategic partners out of the Nordics. So you're going to give us basically an overview of what's going on in Norway, and you're also going to pronounce your name better than I just did.
Well, I'm Magnar Møkkelgård. I'm 71 years old. Used to work for a company called Reitan Convenience, who has about 2,400 stores in the 7 Nordic countries. I retired from Reitan some 7 years ago, but have since worked a little with NACS and had the pleasure of receiving quite a few study groups from all over the world looking at the EV market in Norway.
And when you talk about retired, NACS keeps you busy. We both saw you at the NACS show. You had an August, just recently in the August NACS magazine, you had a story on EVs. So there are an awful lot of people that are looking at Norway as the future or the present with EVs. Can you just kind of give us an overview of where Norway is with EVs and what are the ambitions of the government and policymakers for the EV market there?
Let's start with the ambitions of the policymakers. In Norway, there is a wide political agreement that we need to go towards electric cars. There is a national goal that nobody has really contested, that by 2025, 100% of all private cars sold, new cars sold, should be pure electric. By today, we are at around 83%. So we've had a very fast development, much faster than anybody thought to begin with. Out of the cars on the road, almost 25% are now pure electric, and around Oslo, a little more than 30% are pure electric.
So a little bit more than a year. The goal or the ambition is 100% new cars are EVs.
Yeah.
Are there any penalties or anything like that if this ambition, and I'm using the word ambition deliberately because that was what was in the NACS magazine article, what happens if the ambitions aren't met in a little bit more than a year?
Well, it's just an ambition, so there are no penalties. But of course, there's been a few advantages for the EV buyers. Some years ago, they introduced no VAT on the purchase of EVs. You could drive in the bus lane. Now the bus lanes are too crowded, so they cannot do that anymore. You didn't have any tolls to get into the cities. Now you have to pay half the toll. And it was very advantageous to be an EV owner to start with. Now it's more the other way around, because I think people kind of look, or at least your neighbors will look a little strange if you come by with a new non-electric cars. Everybody expects everybody else to buy electric cars nowadays. So also there's been another development which we shall not forget. Electric cars has become bigger. It's not just small commuter cars anymore. We have the big Teslas, the big Audis, the big Mercedeses, all kinds of cars. So electric cars are exciting, and they are now family cars, not just commuting cars for dad.
So the big value before in ramping up to go from however 0 to 83% of new cars was convenience. You get to
Yeah,
tolls, you get all these other conveniences. Now it's almost like when we flew back from the NACS show, we had TSA pre. TSA pre is
yeah,
supposed to be a convenience, and then you got to that line for TSA pre, and it's like, okay, we need a TSA pre plus because it seemed like everyone was in the TSA pre lane. There's no advantage
yeah,
or minimal advantage. So,
yeah.
how is there any incentive to continue to have people buy EVs? Because if the convenience isn't there, then it just comes down to cost or just acceptance.
Well, cost will be one of the factors here because electricity is cheaper here than gasoline. And of course, gasoline and diesel are heavily taxed. So I guess the government will just raise the taxes more on gasoline and diesel if the development doesn't go the right way. But they have to be careful doing that as well because in the districts and the rural areas, people are much more dependent on diesel than in the cities.
Yeah. So, Magnar, for folks who may not be familiar with the convenience retail market in Norway, maybe particularly in Oslo, can you describe what that retail market is like? Is it food driven? Is it fuel driven? What does a typical convenience store look like?
Well, if we start by segments, 50% of sales through convenience stores are at gas stations. And the other big one is public traffic hubs like railway stations, airports, bus stations, or whatever. So the gas stations have a 50% market share of convenience sales. And I think if you look at the major cities in Oslo, they are more reliant on public transport than perhaps you are used to in the US. As for what drives sales, if we take 7-Eleven in Scandinavia, which Reitan Convenience operates, that is very much a food-driven concept as opposed to the US, which is perhaps more drinks-driven than we have. So it's food. It's also drinks. Coffee, of course, is is a major item all over the world. But I think you, from an American perspective, would be quite impressed at the food part of convenience stores here.
And that's true
Yeah.
throughout Europe, where when we talk about small format, the stores tend to be
Yeah,
smaller because they
yeah,
are near rail stations. So they are often in a densely populated metropolitan area, and a store that might be half the size of a traditional convenience store. Certainly, you don't have a Buc-ee's or something crazy like that. That's just massive. They're tiny stores that just move a lot of people in and out very fast. And
yeah,
then you also, of course, have some that sell fuel, which
yeah.
is a great segue towards how does the EV future affect convenience in Norway and in other countries? What are you seeing when a quarter of the cars right now on the road are electric, and that number will just continue to go up?
If I start with the real bad news, that is that currently in Norway, and this may not be applicable to other markets, it's a consequence of how we live, but 80% of all charging takes place at home. 10% takes place at work. And then the gas stations compete with utilities, other retailers, parking areas, restaurants, whatever, for the last 10%. One figure I find very interesting is that out of all fast charging and flash charging stations, only 22% are on gas stations, which means that you cannot recoup all the fuel sales you lose through charging. And that what is a good location today may not be a good charging location tomorrow.
Yeah, you said in your article, let's face it, the consequence of the rise of EVs is not just putting a charger where the pump used to be.
No. There's another thing which I'm quite fascinated with, and that's the behavior of the car owners. If we think about the way we use our mobile phones, we tend to charge when we can and not when we must. Or we don't go down to 10% before we put the phone into the charger. And the EV owners are more or less the same. They charge when they can. And if it takes 25 minutes to get the car up to 80% or whatever they do, they need something meaningful to do during those 20 to 30 minutes. And that it really turns around the whole shopping thing, because suddenly charging may not be the key shopping mission. The key shopping mission may be to have a lunch, to shop for groceries, or even going to IKEA, who has huge charging spaces here in Norway. Or even less commercially oriented, they just want to stop to check their emails, and while they do that, let's stop a place where we can charge. And then that really starts people thinking in new terms with regard to locations for gas stations and how to build them. So what we have seen lately is quite a few gas stations around along the highways that are brand new, that are much bigger than they used to be, that put the chargers in the front of the station and the gas pumps in the back of the stations, that have dog walking areas, playgrounds for kids, etc., just to create more reasons for the customer to stop there.
Yeah, I like that, because in the US, I think we had conversations when EVs were first coming around. You have a nice, beautiful site where, you have a nice, beautiful canopy where if it's raining and people are filling up, everyone stays dry. But then you have the EV chargers way off in the parking lot,
Yeah.
no canopy,
No.
kind of off in no man's land, far away from the door as they possibly could be. And so it is thinking about that customer and, wanting the EV customer to feel comfortable and safe and dry coming into your store.
Yeah. We had some of that because in the early days, the focus was to build enough chargers. And the people who built chargers were mainly utility companies. And they made some agreements with the operators of gas stations, grocery stores, whoever, just to put chargers on their land and provide that service. And they did not have canopies. They had strange payment options. Nobody had payment by by credit cards. And even handicapped people couldn't get out of the car because it was just too narrow for them, the space. But now we've seen that there is much more focus on the well-being and the convenience of the EV owner, where you have universal design for handicapped people, where you have good payment solutions, and where you also have canopies. You even have canopies with solar panels on top just to supply extra energy during the day, even in Norway.
One of the things we talk a lot about is the customer experience. And I think you just alluded to it in how things have changed, where it's now, I jokingly reference Buc-ee's and how big they are, but in hearing about some of these highway stops, it's really the same
Yeah,
model. It's you're stopping because you want to stop, not because you have to stop. So dog
yeah,
walking, hanging out, enjoying a sandwich,
yeah,
also charging feels
yeah,
like it's the new model of customer experience. Now,
yeah,
at the same time, it sounds like what Norway went through is what the US is now facing, where the idea is the Biden administration wants 500,000 chargers in the US. And
yeah,
that's admirable. But it also
yeah.
sounds like there's some steps that, or recalibration that might need to be happening because it's more than just putting in a charger. It's how does that feed to the experience? Because we can probably put in 500,000 chargers and say, okay, we're
Yep.
done, but they have to be fast charger, they have to be convenient, they have to be a reason to
Mhm.
stop. So, what are the big lessons from Norway and how you started with chargers and then how you adapted to a better way?
Well, one of the lessons may even be that you have to go the same way. Uh, uh, we also had government funded charges to begin with. And the basic idea was to make it possible for all EV owners to travel through the country. And of course, these chargers did not have canopies. They tended to be more outside the grocery stores in the countryside than outside gas stations. But it was important to establish a network fast at that time. And at that time, I think investing in chargers at gas stations were not something that gave a very good payback. So obviously, you needed some volume before you could make commercially funded investments. So what's happening today at gas stations is that none of these charges are funded by the government on anything. While we saw that the utility companies were the first to invest, now three of the four major players invest in their own chargers. They own their own chargers. They buy their own power from the utilities. So, because of the general volume we now have, we are in another phase.
I'm still struck by the number of electric vehicles on the road in Norway. We, we we know it's the most progressive country on Earth with EVs. And when you say that 25% of the vehicles on the road right now are electric, even though most of the new cars are, it takes a while to cycle through the fleet because people hold on to
Yeah,
cars for 10, 20 years. Yeah,
15 to 18
yeah.
years.
In the US, we did a survey last year where we asked consumers, what percentage of the cars on the road in the US do you think are EVs? And they said 15%, which is pretty close to the 25 in Norway, but that's nowhere near reality because in the US it's under 1%, but growing.
Yeah,
So
and yep,
so what are it's going to take a while. I suppose is the message to get, and it's going to take a while for Norway to continue to go from 25% to much closer to 100. It's going to take another decade or two, won't it?
yeah, another decade, not two, but another decade, yes. But it's like I think the development in other countries. I'm not saying the U.S. now. I'm thinking perhaps more like Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands will be faster than in Norway once it has started. And one of the main reasons for that is that the cars are bigger, they are more exciting. You can have an electric car as the only car, not just as the commuting car. And electric cars tend to be in fashion, they fascinate people. So I think things will grow faster in other countries.
So, how did Norway mitigate the concerns around range anxiety, which is tends to be top, if not number one issue for American consumers of wanting to not buy an electric car?
Let me put it this way. I don't hear anybody talking about range anxiety anymore. But we're back to people charging when they can and
Right.
not when they have to. But of course, you have a problem, and that's Christmas, holidays, things like that. Sometimes charging stations are much too big for the regular part of the year, and then suddenly much too small when people start moving for Christmas or during their holidays. There was even a huge highway station on the way south from Oslo that had problems getting their staff to work because the line from the highway up to the charges were so long that the staff was stuck there. So how to even out the seasons, it will really be a challenge for everybody.
Is there going to be another level of convenience? I was joking about TSA pre. Is there going to be, if you pay more money, there's another line? I would imagine that wouldn't go over well with normal customers, but it's an interesting point there, that almost thinking like toll booths, that before there were all these electronic payments, toll booths, you drive down some highways, there's 30 or 40 toll booths. And that was great for the busy times, but for the not busy times, it's certainly way too many.
Mhm.
So it is an interesting dynamic that we how do you figure out peak times, because it still has to be physical charging.
Yeah. And I don't think you will have this type of TSA pre-cleared lanes. I think one of the other key difficulties is that there are no good standards for electric cars. So once they are in a lane, some cars can be charged at the back of the car, some at the front of the cars, some of the on the left side, some on the right side. So just sorting the regular line to get them to drive into spaces that they can actually use is a challenge in many places. And what we see is that, and what they have learned is that the most efficient charging spaces is those where you can drive straight into and drive straight out of.
Kind of like a gas pump.
Yeah.
With a traditional internal combustion engine, there's an arrow on one side or the other, but it's still confusing.
Right.
If you're in a rental car and I can't figure out which one, and it's not much rhyme or reason, and it sounds like that rhyme or reason that existed with traditional vehicles was ignored for some of these new cars.
Yeah.
So it sounds like Norway continues to lead, and people continue to look to Norway to see what the future. We talk a lot about, the future is unevenly distributed, but in some places it already exists, and it's just a matter of how it will happen around the world. Is there anything, final takeaway, that you would suggest to retailers, whether in Europe or in the US, that they should look at and learn from Norway as the future unfolds in these countries?
I think one thing is not to underestimate the changing customer behavior. And while a few retailers may be used to talking about the conversion rate from pump to store, sometimes it may be the reverse conversion rate that may be relevant for the EV user. Another thing is to think in terms of that. It's different having people who stay by the pump for 4 minutes to fill up their cars, and then have people who come in for 25 minutes. You have to have seating there. 5-6 years ago, almost no Norwegian gas stations had seating inside. Now they all do, as a logic consequence of that. And then we're back to the regular reasons to stop. You need to have clean restrooms, things like that, to make it an attractive place to stop. There was one British convenience leader that was asked what he did with his stations, and he said, when we are successful, it's because we have added stickiness to the stores. Mm-hmm. And I think adding stickiness is a key thing going forward. And then, of course, there will be a shakeout. And sometimes as an owner of real estate, you have to start looking into what will be the alternative use of this real estate, and if this piece of real estate can have a higher value doing something else than being a gas station.
It'll be interesting how the future shakes out, and it's interesting to see what's going on in Norway, because that certainly is a pretty advanced version of the future. Thank you for joining us today. I'm sure we'll be talking again, although I hear that you are taking a little, we talk about road trips. You're taking a little bit more than a road trip. You are going to be going around the world for a little bit, aren't you?
I am next year, so I look forward to that. You know, when you're retired, you can do things like that. But I've said to NACS that I will be back with NACS later next year. So you haven't seen the last of me yet.
No, we have not. Well, bon voyage, Magnar. I hope you have a great trip, and we will talk to you soon. And thank you, everyone, for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.